on February 24th, 2020. Sarah Boone and her boyfriend George Torres were spending the evening together at Sarah's home. Their relationship had a tumultuous history, with both having been arrested for domestic violence, yet they always seemed to reconcile. That night, the couple was drinking together. What followed, however, is both shocking and puzzling. At some point during the evening, George got inside a suitcase, which was then zipped shut. The reasons behind how and why he ended up in the suitcase remain unclear, but what we do know is that George later begged to be let out. He pleaded with Sarah to unzip the suitcase, desperate to breathe. Instead of helping, Sarah decided to record him on her phone, documenting his cries for help. George's voice is heard pleading for his life, yet Sarah did nothing to help him. The next morning, she finally called 911, claiming that they had been playing hide and seek, and George had somehow gotten trapped inside the suitcase. When authorities arrived, they found George dead, and Sarah was charged with second-degree murder. Sarah is now claiming that she was the victim of abuse and is using battered spouse syndrome as her defense. But the details of what truly happened inside that apartment and why George was in that suitcase remain unclear. This case has gripped the public, especially because of the video Sarah recorded. In the video, which some may find difficult to watch, you hear George's voice from inside the suitcase, begging for help. Sarah's voice, calm and detached, responds, even mocking him at times. The footage is disturbing, and it will undoubtedly be a focal point in the trial. Now, the key question at trial will be, how long was George trapped in that suitcase? When did he enter, and how long did it take for the suitcase to finally be opened? To help answer these questions, we have Court TV digital content producer Lauren Silver, who has been covering the story extensively, and forensic pathologist Dr. Priya Banerjee. Lauren, let's start with you. We know that the night started at around 4 p.m. with the couple sharing a bottle of wine while painting and doing puzzles. But by 11:12 p.m., George was already inside the suitcase, struggling to breathe, as captured in the first video Sarah recorded. Could you fill in some of the blanks here, especially regarding the timeline? What was happening between 4 p.m. and the moment George ended up inside that suitcase? It was the morning of February 25th, 2020, when Sarah Boone was jolted awake by the persistent ringing of her phone. She glanced around, assuming the call was from her ex-husband, but something felt off. George, her boyfriend, wasn't beside her. The events of the previous night flooded back, and a wave of dread washed over her. Sarah descended the stairs and walked into the living room, her heart pounding. There, lying on the floor, was the suitcase. George had gotten inside it the night before, but now something was horribly wrong. He wasn't moving. She rushed to unzip the suitcase, but George was unresponsive. In a panic, instead of calling emergency services, she reached for her phone and dialed her ex-husband, urging him to come over. When he arrived, he too realized the gravity of the situation. George was still lifeless, and they needed to call 911. It wasn't until 1 p.m. that the police arrived at the house, by which time George had been inside the suitcase for far too long. As the investigation unfolded, a chilling timeline began to take shape. The previous evening, Sarah and George had spent their time at home, drinking and painting, an attempt to enjoy a quiet night together. Their relationship had always been stormy, punctuated by frequent arguments and even domestic violence, but they somehow always found their way back to each other. This night, however, would take a dark and tragic turn. At some point, what began as an evening of relaxation turned into a bizarre game of hide and seek. According to Sarah's later account, George willingly climbed inside the suitcase, laughing as he did so. Sarah zipped it up, but two of George's fingers were still sticking out. The zipper was broken, so she improvised, using a paperclip to seal the suitcase shut. As time passed, the situation turned from playful to desperate. George began to plead from inside the suitcase, struggling to breathe. He called out to Sarah, begging for her to let him out. But instead of unzipping the suitcase, she took out her phone and started to record. The video is harrowing. George's muffled voice is heard pleading for his life, gasping for air. "I can't breathe, Sarah," he says repeatedly, his words growing weaker. Sarah's voice, cold and detached, responds with indifference. "That's what you get for everything you've done to me," she says at one point. And when George continues to beg, she mocks him, telling him to shut up. Hours passed. Sarah claimed that she went to bed assuming George would find his own way out of the suitcase. But the next morning, it became clear that he hadn't, and now he never would. When investigators pieced together the timeline, it became apparent that George had likely been inside the suitcase for nearly 12 hours. Questions swirled about how long someone could survive in such confined conditions. According to forensic experts, being crammed inside the suitcase would have severely restricted George's ability to breathe. His chest, unable to fully expand, would have been compressed, and as the air inside the suitcase ran out, he would have been left gasping for oxygen. The lack of ventilation meant he was effectively sealed in an airtight space. George Torres wasn't a large man, which explained how he managed to fit inside the suitcase, but the human body wasn't made to survive in such cramped quarters. Once the oxygen was depleted, survival would only have been possible for a few minutes at most. His struggle would have been agonizing as he fought for every breath. As Sarah Boone faces trial for second-degree murder, her defense hinges on a claim of battered spouse syndrome, portraying herself as the victim in a toxic and abusive relationship. But the details of what transpired inside that apartment tell a different story. A story of a man trapped, suffocating in a suitcase, pleading for his life, and being met with cold indifference. What led George Torres to climb into that suitcase? And why did Sarah Boone decide to leave him there to die? These are the questions that will be asked in court, but for now, the disturbing facts of that night are undeniable. A man's life ended in a dark, confined space, while the person who could have saved him watched and did nothing. The horrifying events surrounding George Torres's final moments inside a suitcase are both perplexing and deeply unsettling. It's a story that began with a seemingly innocent game, only to spiral into tragedy and confusion. As the situation became clearer, experts began to piece together what might have happened during the long hours George was trapped. It wasn't a simple matter of him running out of air immediately. Rather, it was a slow and torturous decline. Dr. Priya Banerjee, a forensic pathologist, explained that George's body would have gradually used up the oxygen inside the suitcase. At first, he might have been confused, his brain fogging as the oxygen levels dropped. His body would become weaker, expending more energy in a desperate attempt to survive while using up the precious little air left in the confined space. The struggle would have been slow and agonizing. To make things worse, as George was calling out for help, Sarah Boone wasn't just ignoring him. She was laughing. The recorded video captures her mocking him, even as his pleas for air became more frantic. At some point, it seems Sarah may have even left the room, leaving George to face his final moments alone, which is perhaps the most disturbing part of this story. The investigation grew more complex as the second video came to light, showing the suitcase in a different position from the first. It raised many questions. How did the suitcase flip over? Was it George struggling inside, trying to free himself? Or had Sarah herself moved it? The shifting of the suitcase pointed to something more sinister, a potential act of torture as George desperately tried to escape. The first video shows the suitcase face down, with George pressing against it from inside, his muffled voice pleading. But in the second video, the suitcase had moved, flipped onto its back, lying to the side of the living room. Clearly, something had changed, but Sarah gave no explanation for this. The timeline of events revealed more chilling details. Sarah claimed she had fallen asleep, thinking George would find his own way out. But as morning came, and she was woken by her phone ringing, she realized George was still inside the suitcase. When she finally unzipped it, she found him unresponsive, cold to the touch. Her first instinct wasn't to call for help immediately, but to reach out to her ex-husband instead. It wasn't until after he arrived and urged her to call 911 that emergency services were contacted. By then, hours had passed, and it was too late to save George. The most troubling aspect of the case came from the evidence in the videos. In the first clip, George was still alive, his voice weak but still pleading for Sarah to open the suitcase. "I can't breathe," he said over and over again, but Sarah's cold, mocking response was all he received in return. "That's what you get for everything you've done to me," she said at one point, her voice filled with cruel amusement. The second video, shorter but equally damning, showed the suitcase in a different position. It was clear that George had continued to struggle for his life after the first recording stopped. When investigators examined the footage, they noticed the suitcase had flipped between recordings. In the first, George was pushing from inside and the suitcase was face down. But in the second, it had moved, lying on its back and slightly to the left of where it had been earlier. What had happened during the hours between these videos? Was George frantically shifting inside, trying to free himself as the air ran out? Or had Sarah, in a final act of cruelty, moved the suitcase herself? There was no answer from Sarah, and the silence only deepened the mystery. Forensic pathologists like Dr. Banerjee examined the potential injuries George may have sustained. Being crammed inside a suitcase, his body contorted and struggling, would have caused extreme physical stress. The lack of oxygen would have led to suffocation within minutes. But before that, his body might have been bruised or battered from his attempts to escape. Detectives noted that no medical conditions or external factors explained George's death beyond the suffocation caused by being trapped for so long. As the case against Sarah Boone unfolds, the public is left grappling with disturbing images and unanswered questions. How long did George suffer inside that suitcase, and why didn't Sarah act to save him? The chilling recordings paint a grim picture of a man fighting for his life, while the woman who could have saved him stood by, laughing at his suffering. Ultimately, George Torres's final moments were spent in darkness, suffocating in a small, confined space, with his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. The case continues to unravel, but the haunting details of those hours inside the suitcase will remain a disturbing reminder of a life lost in unimaginable circumstances. The night of February 23, 2020, started innocently enough for Sarah Boone and her boyfriend, George Torres. They had a history of a tumultuous relationship, marred by accusations of cheating and domestic violence. A tragic accident fueled by alcohol, or was there malicious intent behind her decision to ignore his pleas and record his desperate struggle for life? As the investigation continues, more questions linger about what happened in that apartment. How long did George fight for his life inside the suitcase, and why didn't Sarah act sooner? The haunting videos will undoubtedly play a crucial role in the upcoming trial, where Sarah will have to explain her inexplicable behavior that night. For now, the public is left grappling with the chilling image of a man trapped, begging for mercy, while the one person who could have saved him chose to do nothing. The night was supposed to be uneventful, a calm evening with a bottle of wine, a bit of puzzle-making, and lighthearted banter. Sarah Boone and her boyfriend, George Torres, found themselves in what seemed like a playful mood, but that night would end in tragedy. Sarah claims they decided to play hide-and-seek, a childish game that quickly spiraled into a nightmare. At some point, George ended up inside a suitcase, zipped in by Sarah herself. Sarah later told the police that George had willingly climbed into the suitcase and that it was all part of their fun. What started as a strange game, however, ended with George's life being extinguished. After zipping him inside, Sarah said she went upstairs to bed, leaving George trapped. By the next morning, everything changed. Sarah's phone rang repeatedly around 11 a.m., pulling her from sleep. Groggy and confused, she realized that George wasn't beside her. It wasn't until she went downstairs and saw the suitcase still in the living room that she made the horrifying connection. George was still inside. In a panic, she unzipped the suitcase, only to find George unresponsive, his body still and cold. Frantically, Sarah called her ex-husband, who lived nearby, before reaching out to 911. "I didn't know what to do," she explained to the officers who arrived at the scene, trying to make sense of what had happened. She told them she had attempted CPR, but George wasn't breathing, and nothing she did could revive him. Her story seemed straightforward at first. They had been drinking, playing around, and she fell asleep, leaving George in the suitcase. However, as the investigation unfolded, questions arose about Sarah's version of events. On the body cam footage recorded by the responding officers, Sarah nervously explains her actions that morning, repeating the same details. She woke up around noon, found George in the suitcase, and tried to perform CPR. Yet there seemed to be discrepancies about the exact timing, leaving investigators wondering whether she was consistent with her story or if there were crucial details she was hiding. When asked about her state of mind the night before, Sarah downplayed their drinking, claiming that neither she nor George was drunk. She insisted that they were simply having fun, enjoying each other's company, and that nothing seemed amiss until she woke up the next day to the horrifying reality. But police would later uncover 2 haunting videos recorded on Sarah's phone, videos that showed George begging for his life while locked in the suitcase. His desperate pleas, "I can't breathe," were met with Sarah's cruel laughter. As the investigation continued, a neighbor's testimony added another layer of darkness to the story. The neighbor described hearing a loud crash around 10:30 or 11 p.m., suggesting that something or someone had fallen down the stairs. The possibility that George, still trapped inside the suitcase, may have been rolled down the stairs opened up a new line of inquiry. Could Sarah have been deliberately toying with him, moving the suitcase while he was helpless inside? Forensic experts would later weigh in, explaining that the small, cramped space inside the suitcase likely made it impossible for George to free himself. With the zipper portion facing the ground in one of the videos, it would have been nearly impossible for him to push his way out. Even if the zipper wasn't broken, George would have struggled to move or breathe in such tight confines. The case against Sarah Boone centers on one key question: why didn't she help him? Why did she leave George locked inside the suitcase, even as he pleaded for air? Whether it was a game gone terribly wrong or something far more sinister, Sarah's actions, or lack thereof, led to George's death. Now, as the trial approaches, Sarah's story is under intense scrutiny. Her lawyer argues that any inconsistencies in her statements are the result of panic and confusion, not deception. Yet, the haunting evidence captured on her phone paints a chilling picture of a woman who seemed disturbingly indifferent to her boyfriend's suffering. As the courtroom proceedings begin, jurors will have to grapple with the conflicting narratives: Sarah's claim of an innocent mistake versus the damning video evidence showing her mocking George's final moments. Sarah Boone's story is one shrouded in a mix of confusion, fear, and unsettling revelations. It began with what she described as a playful evening with her partner, George Torres. They had shared 2 bottles of wine, engaging in puzzle-making and light-hearted moments. But somewhere along the way, the night took a deadly turn. In her initial account to police, Sarah claimed that George had willingly gotten into a suitcase as part of a game of hide-and-seek. She zipped him up, they laughed, and then she went upstairs to bed, only to awaken the next morning and discover his lifeless body still trapped inside. However, as more details emerged, the narrative began to shift. The night of George Torres's death was just another chapter in this disturbing saga. Sarah recalls the events leading up to that fateful night as a blur of insults and rage. She was asleep when George stormed in, waking her up with a barrage of verbal abuse. He called her names, berating her for reasons she couldn't fully understand in her half-awake state. Despite the insults, Sarah tried to keep the peace. Feed the beast, she thought, as she decided to go outside and smoke a cigarette with George to calm him down. All the while, his words continued to cut into her. He was verbally abusive with me, belittling me, she recounted, her voice steady but worn. She hoped to diffuse the situation by spending time with him, but nothing seemed to work. His anger had grown beyond control. This wasn't the first time Sarah had endured George's wrath. In fact, their relationship was marked by a long history of domestic violence. Attorney Frank Bankowitz confirmed this grim reality, stating that there was indeed a long, documented history of abuse. This history would become a focal point of Sarah's defense in court, particularly her claim of battered spouse syndrome. There were multiple incidents where George had severely beaten Sarah, with one instance as recent as June 15, 2019, when she suffered injuries to her face, head, legs, and arms. On that occasion, Sarah begged George to stop, only for him to respond, "You're going to die." This history of violence wasn't just in Sarah's words. It was substantiated by George's arrest records. He had been arrested on several occasions for battering Sarah, most notably in 2019, when he was taken into custody 4 times in just a few months. His violent outbursts were triggered by his suspicion of Sarah speaking to other men, and each time the abuse escalated, leaving her physically and emotionally scarred. James Owens, Sarah's new attorney, confirmed that her defense would rely heavily on this history of domestic violence, supported by expert testimony from Dr. Julie Harper. The goal was to paint a full picture of the abuse Sarah had endured, offering an explanation for why the events of that tragic night unfolded the way they did. George's pattern of violence was well documented: arrests for battery, violating pretrial release conditions by contacting Sarah, and continued abuse even after being warned by the law. But now, the challenge would be whether the jury would hear all of this history and understand the depths of Sarah's suffering. In the courtroom, these past incidents could make or break Sarah's defense. The defense aimed to argue that years of torment had culminated in a night where Sarah, pushed to the brink, acted out of a desperate need for survival. But the evidence, particularly the haunting Suitcase video where Sarah taunted George as he pleaded for air, threatened to overshadow her claims of self-defense. The night George died, Sarah's life changed forever. Now, as she faces trial with her 9th lawyer, the history of abuse, her account of what happened, and the chilling details of that night will all be scrutinized. Sarah's story of enduring years of torment, trying to keep the peace, and ultimately watching a tragic end unfold will be laid bare before a jury who will decide her fate. The trial, long delayed and plagued by complications, finally seemed like it would happen. And when it does, the world will watch to see if Sarah Boone's story of abuse and survival will be enough to sway the jury.